Hello again, welcome. So, a couple of days ago, 19th of May 2020, David Frost, the Prime Minister's Europe advisor and chief negotiator of Task Force Europe, was constrained to write a letter to Michel Barnier, the EU chief negotiator, in order to put the record straight regarding Barnier's assertion that the UK was being intransigent and unrealistic in its negotiating stance. So, what did the letter say, and why has it been made public? The EU has made the comment that the UK expects to retain the benefits of the single market whilst not being a member of it. This is just not true. So the letter has had to state quite clearly that we have tried to be clear consistently that we are looking for a suite of agreements with a free trade agreement at the core. We do not seek to remain part of the single market or the customs union, as we do not believe this is in the UK interest. Accordingly, as you know, our legal texts draw on precedent where legal relevant precedent exists, and we have made pragmatic proposals where it does not, for example on road transport or energy cooperation. So, for example, our draft free trade agreement approximates very closely those that the EU has agreed with Canada or Japan. The letter goes on to mention similarities between other sections of the proposed agreement with other existing agreements with Norway, Japan, Canada, etc., to illustrate the fact that these proposals are doable because they have already been done elsewhere. So that's the first lie put to bed. Basically, the EU wants to put the blame squarely in Britain's court so that when it all falls to pieces, they can blame us and they can be seen to be the poor, hard-done-by victims. That way they can stir up hatred against the UK whilst they remain the heroes. You start to see why it was made public. We can't have our Remainers believing yet again the bullshit from the EU. Nor do we want the EU citizens to believe that we are the villains of the piece. In fact, they need to know what a bunch of conniving, bullying bastards the EU really is, something the UK leavers have known for years. Mr. Frost's letter continues to point out that the EU is insisting on additional unbalanced and unprecedented provisions in a range of areas as a precondition for agreement between us. In other words, they are treating us as a special case for the simple reason that they do not recognise us as an independent sovereign nation, but as an apostate to be demeaned and punished, rather than draw the line and look at the UK as a country not just seeking a trade deal, but offering a trade deal. They are trying to keep us under their control and keep everything as it was before we left, whilst depriving us of any political influence. The second point is that the EU, whilst trying to impose extra conditions, it also is not willing even to copy the provisions found in previous free trade agreements with other countries. For example, they are not willing to replicate sector-specific provisions for key industries with particular technical barriers such as motor vehicles, medicinal products, organics and chemicals, which have been agreed with or proposed to one or more of Canada, South Korea, Chile and the US, amongst others. They'll do it for other countries, and all of those bar the US mentioned above are smaller economies than ours, but they won't do it for us. But it's our fault that negotiations are not progressing. The third point is this, so-called level playing field. It seems that to them level means sloping and we have to play uphill. The UK has already laid out its commitment to the level playing field in the political declaration. The UK proposals are closely modelled on similar arrangements already agreed by the EU with similar countries, notably in the Canada Free Trade Agreement. Commissioner Hogan described the Canada provisions in March as solid and anchored in a vast network of underlying international conventions and agreements. And no doubt this is why the EU has found it possible to come very close to zero tariff, zero quota access in this and other agreements, some eliminating tariffs on over 99% of tariff lines, without finding it necessary to go beyond such standard level playing field provisions. But they won't do it for us. And we are the ones, apparently, who are being obstructive. The EU is going further. It insists that the UK simply accepts EU state aid rules, that the EU and only the EU can put tariffs on trade with the UK if we breach those rules, and would require us to accept an enforcement mechanism which gives a specific role to the European Court of Justice. In other words, we give them all the authority they need to bully us into submission, but we are the ones being unreasonable. In justification for their unreasonable proposals, the EU makes a number of fatuous points. They claim that the UK is being offered a future relationship of unprecedented depth. The UK, in response, has said that if it is the mutual commitment to zero tariffs that makes these provisions necessary, then we would be willing to discuss a relationship that was based on less than that, as in other free trade agreements. The EU has said that they are not willing to have such discussions, but we are the obstructive ones. The EU have claimed that it is the level of economic integration between the UK and the EU which justifies such provisions. In fact, as a share of the economy, the UK is already less integrated in trade terms with the EU than Switzerland, Norway, or the Ukraine. Alternatively, they justify it in terms of trade flows, yet the EU did not insist that the US made any level playing field commitments in the TTIP negotiations beyond those typical to a normal free trade agreement, although the US and the UK trade flows with the EU are roughly similar. But we are the ones refusing to move forwards. The EU is also claiming that the provisions are required on the grounds of proximity. Frankly, this is the most ridiculous of the lot, in my opinion. They are saying that because we are next door, extra provisions regarding keeping us under their heel are necessary. To my knowledge, this has never appeared in any free trade agreement in the world. Canada is pretty close to the US, but they manage without these ridiculous provisions. As David Frost says, this proximity argument amounts to saying that a country in Europe cannot expect to determine its own rules simply on the grounds of geography, and that it must bend to EU norms. That is not an argument that can hope to be accepted in the 21st century. The EU is also insisting that access to our fishing grounds should remain the same as they are now. That gives them the right to take control, or what gives them the right to take control of our waters. But we are the unreasonable ones. What it boils down to is this. The EU should draw the line under the Brexit deal and deal with the UK as a sovereign state offering to negotiate a mutually beneficial free trade agreement. Our previous history with the EU should not influence the terms of the agreement, but in fact should make things easier because we already have equivalents in all areas, and we also have communications and systems set up in areas of, for example, the exchange of information about terrorism and other crimes. But the EU cannot let go of the idea that we are leaving the Union, so they will be losing the benefits that they gain from our membership at a cost to the UK. They are therefore desperate to keep as close to the status quo as possible. That would rather defeat the object of our leaving. We do not want to be under the heel of the ECJ. We need to have the freedom to make our own laws and trade as we will. We need to make decisions regarding how we maintain our own industrial and commercial infrastructure without the interference of a foreign power. No other country has been asked to give up control of its fishing grounds in exchange for a free trade agreement, so why should we? No other country has been asked to accept EU regulations regarding state aid rules, giving the EU all power of punishment with no redress. So when someone tells you that the UK is being obstructive and has not put forward proposals, get them to read David Frost's letter, which explains how the EU has been lying to save its own face. See ya. Hi, I'm Stephen, and I hope this video gave you some food for thought. If you'd like to see more of the same, please subscribe. See ya.